Dr. Annang Asumang is a senior academic at the South African Theological Seminary, SATS. He is also affiliated with the Hull York Medical School, serves as a consultant in anesthesia and intensive care medicine, and is an ACTA board member. Dr. Annang was born in Ghana and developed an early commitment to Christian discipleship through the Ministry of Scripture Union in West Africa. He later trained in anesthesia and intensive care medicine in the United Kingdom while also pursuing formal theological education. He holds a BA in Biblical Studies, accredited by the University of Liverpool, as well as an MTH and a PhD from the South African Theological Seminary. His doctoral research examined disciple formation in the Gospels of Mark and John. He teaches in both theological and medical education, and has supervised numerous postgraduate research projects. He has contributed to academic publications, presented at conferences, and serves as a peer reviewer and co-editor of scholarly work. He also teaches at the Daniel Institute in Ghana and serves as an elder at Grimsby Baptist Church in the UK. He is married to Edna, and they have 3 adult children.
Thank you very much. Each time I'm introduced as an anesthetist, I have a disclaimer to give. I am very good at talking people to sleep. So if you fall asleep, you have an excuse. I pray that most of you will be awake by the end of this presentation. It is really a great honor to be asked to address you, my dear brothers and sisters, at this August gathering, and more so on a topic that I'm sure we all agree on and could be better delivered by any one of you, I'm sure. And my work has been made easier by the superb keynote address we have just heard from Professor Kello. And in a sense, I will have to repeat some of his brilliant arguments. I am particularly enthused by the fact that my topic resonates with some of the ideas expressed by the past president of the AEA, Bishop Goodwill Sana, and at his keynote address, which he delivered last year in Nairobi at the AEA General Assembly. Bishop Sana challenged us that the church in Africa must engage society with a prophetic vision grounded in righteousness, justice, humility, and truth. And that prophetic voice is not just a matter of criticizing what is wrong, but embodying and articulating what is right. That is what Bishop Shana said. And I wholeheartedly agree with that. My thesis is narrower. I hope to convince you, my dear brothers and sisters, that to fruitfully engage our African realities, theological educators in Africa must prioritize a pedagogy of formation of prophetic church leaders. And the template of this is laid down in the Pastoral Epistles. And this is really going to be a major focus of my talk. The premise of my thesis, which I have articulated, I was very surprised to note, almost a decade ago, and here I quote myself, it is the core purpose of theological education to train the leaders who will steer the church of the future, as epitomized by the age-old slogan, as goes the seminary, so goes the church. It is our core duty to analyze, to discern, and to critique the forces shaping the socio-religious milieu of the contemporary church. It is our core duty to bring the unchanging truth of the gospel to bear on illuminating these forces. It is our core duty to employ our insights and the insights we gain from this to predict future trends, suggest strategic responses, and monitor the effectiveness of the implementation of these responses. This is what I hope to expand on this morning. I share the view that has been articulated in various forms that the church in Africa is once again at a propitious moment of global history. I believe this will not be viewed by any one of us as a controversial statement. My argument now is that this propitious moment imposes specific demands upon us, uh, uh, who God has called and gifted to His church to train men and women fitted for this time. After all, God's methods are human beings. God's methods are not strategies. They are not machines, as E.M. Bounds said many years ago. They are human beings. Theological education attuned to this propitious moment will toil, and I'm quoting the Apostle Paul, will toil, struggling with all his energy that he powerfully works within us to raise church workers able to meet the moment. And the Bible, especially the Pastoral Epistles, give us the insight and the tools for doing that. That is my thesis. Now, I established this thesis with three interlinked propositions. First, I employ a brief socio-historical analysis to outline the nature of the opportunities and the challenges of the concrete realities of Africa in the global context. And I want to stress in the global context. I draw on evidence that by the providential grace of God, the church in Africa is poised to play a crucial leadership role in global Christianity. And the opportunities and the challenges that this presents requires intentional crafting of a pedagogy, forgive that term, pedagogy, a special pedagogy in our seminaries and theological institutions. The second proposition goes back in time to the first century to argue that by virtue of their contextual scenarios, and I'm very gratified that the pastor who preached earlier did mention this, by the virtue of their contextual scenarios, their generic intentionalities, and their explicit articulation of pastoral formational theology, the Pastoral Epistles serve as programmatic scaffolding of ideas we need for framing such a pedagogy. And with this in mind, I thirdly reflectively enumerate an outline of some of the distinctive features of this pedagogy. A good point to start is how Agenda 2063, the Africa we want, sums up the current realities of the continent. Now, though this document is more than a decade old, it sketches out a bird's eye view of the situation of the continent, not just as it is, but also how it wishes it to be. In so doing, its 7 aspirations serve as a blueprint for concretizing the shortfall, the difference, the deficiencies of our socio-political realities. It is within this canvas that the extraordinary dynamism of the church in Africa must be evaluated, and even more so within the global scene. We have not only seen Philip Jenkins' 2002 prediction in the next Christendom that in the coming decades, and I quote Philip Jenkins, the vast majority of believers will be neither white nor European nor Euro-American, and that if we wished to visualize a typical contemporary Christian, we should think of a woman living in a village in Nigeria. We have not just seen this fulfilled in our lifetime. Much more, many studies, many predictions and publications, some admittedly based on demographic analysis with their deficiencies, we must admit, and others on concrete social religious observations. These studies have indeed confirmed that Africa is once again poised to play a leading role, a center of gravity, as some term it, in steering the global church. And the most recent manifestation of this fulfillment is what we saw last week in Abuja, Nigeria, when GAFCON reordered, I'm using their words, the Global Anglican Communion. Similar transformations, I know, are occurring in other mainstream denominations and parachurch organizations. And we see it also in the global north itself, where African immigrants are increasingly playing vital roles in the directions of these denominations, churches, and parachurch organizations. In addition to these concrete realities, global Christian leaders themselves profess their expectation of leadership from African churches in the coming years. 3 months ago, more than that, a few months ago, the Lausanne movement released results of a survey of Christian leaders of 119 countries, comparing their perceptions of the expected futures of the Christian dynamism in their respective continents. Now, few should be surprised that the highest expectation was from among African leaders. Now, I don't want to belabor this point, as I am sure I have your agreement with it. I am aware also that there is a hubristic tendency for some of us Africans to over-romanticize these realities, these findings, to draw wrong conclusions from it, and especially to be blinded by the enormous problems that lay underneath this rosy picture. I'm aware of that, and I'm not skipping over them. All the same, we cannot fail to grasp the profoundly humbling realities of the church in Africa at this time in the context of global Christianity. We are at a propitious time. Now, may I remind you, my brothers and sisters, this is not the first time that Africa has played a similar role. Some scholars have drawn interesting parallels between our time and the 2nd to 4th century AD, when African theologians ably led global Christianity. From the works of Thomas Oden to my own countryman Kwame Bediako to Shaw and Gator, there are several publications like that who have done instructive comparisons to remind us that there was a time that a church in Africa played a similarly leading role in global Christianity. And one such reminder was at the tail end of last year during the celebration of the 1700th anniversary of the Nicene Creed. Now, for those like me who didn't know this, I didn't know this until I read the paper. Sarah Parvis' paper in our journal, Actis Journal, demonstrated the foundational roles that North African and Ethiopian, I didn't realize the Ethiopian component especially, North African and Ethiopian theologians played in drafting that ecumenical creed, which continues to define Christian orthodoxy. Now, I know our brother Biancato will be proud that I use that word, orthodoxy, and I think it is so important. Let me quote what Sarah Parvis says in that paper. As Christianity strengthens in the global south, And African Christianity reconsiders its relationship to the theological formulations of the early church. It is important that the Africanness of the Nicene Creed is not forgotten. The Creed of 325 AD, wherever one stands on its theology, should be considered around the world as one of the most significant and lasting fruits of early African theological debate. It is a sobering thought, my brothers and sisters, but it's a realistic prospect as we think of future ready. To imagine us today playing similarly influential role for global Christianity as our North African ancestors did. But this is our reality. And I say this, that this has been imposed upon us by the Lord God Almighty. It's not something that we have sought to pursue. Now, this reality presents us with two categories of opportunities. One is inward and internal, directed towards the African continent, and the other is outward and external, directed to the church's role in global Christianity. The first demands determined efforts to entrench faithful Christian discipleship in the continent, discipleship that impacts Christian living in people's daily bread and butter existence. It requires strategic endeavors to cement the gains of the rapid church growth, while at the same time neutralizing the negative tendencies associated with that exponential growth. The second opportunity is outward and external, and it requires enthusiastic embrace of the global leadership mantle that God is laying upon us, especially the urgent need to safeguard faithful Christian orthodoxy. Now, some African scholars have argued that the two categories of opportunities contradict each other. And even if they don't, the limited capacity of the African church makes it impossible to concentrate on pursuing both at the same time. Now, I see where this argument comes from, especially as it reflects humble appreciation of the enormity of the challenges that we face. However, I believe with all my heart, and I've vehemently argued this in a paper before, I passionately believe that the two opportunities necessarily belong to each other, and that we are left little choice to grapple with both at the same time. And that is a challenge for us. I certainly reject the overly introspective line of argument which our brother Cato fought 50 years ago, which we are fighting still, which sees these opportunities through the prism of Africanization of Christianity, rather than the prism of safeguarding the gospel, safeguarding the Christian orthodoxy, global Christianity. The 2,000 years of Christian history certainly shows that no single enclave of the church has ever been enabled to fruitfully entrench Christian orthodoxy in its region by being disinterested in other parts of the world. None. Historically, none. Sooner or later, heterodoxy will arrive at the door of a naively insular and insulated Christianity. The two tasks belong to each other. It's tough, I know, but they belong to each other. Let me put my point less grandiosely. It is in our embracing the mantle of global safeguarding orthodoxy that we will be able to adequately entrench deep-rooted discipleship in Africa. The converse is also true. It is in our entrenching faithful discipleship that we will be enabled to lead in safeguarding orthodox Christianity in the world. The two responsibilities belong to each other. Now, I'm not suggesting for a minute that shouldering these responsibilities will be easy. I don't need to convince you, my dear brothers and sisters, of the enormities of the enormity of the challenges we face in fulfilling these callings. They are almost overwhelming. The concrete realities of the church in Africa include significant socio-economic challenges, widespread Christian nominalism, often marred by religious syncretism, moral recession, as our pastor said earlier, and public corruption, increasingly violent geopolitical climate, fueled by aggressive radical Islam, and our own denominational and ethnic divisions and frictions. Some of these challenges are natural results of the exponential growth of the church. Others reflect the cultural exigencies of our time, and yet others have emerged from experimentations and deviations from orthodoxy, which invariably accompany any revivals. You add to these challenges the leadership deficit that we have and a paucity of resources for theological education. And we are right to say with Paul, who is equal to such a task? As he says. Well, as the apostle goes on to say in the next verse, what is needed, he says, is men of sincerity, remember integrity, men commissioned by God, and men who walk in the sight of God. In other words, what is required is a prophetic church led by prophetic church workers who speak with prophetic voices and live prophetic lives. That is what we need. The term prophetic is increasingly understood in two ways, and I regard them as complementing each other. Some may well disagree. On the one hand is what I have termed, for lack of a better term, what I call communitarian prophetism. It's often characterized by speaking truth to power. It focuses on social analysis, community engagement, conflict resolution, advocacy for justice, and alleviating poverty. So communitarian prophetism is driven by the imperative to oppose systemic injustices, challenge corrupt leadership, critique exploitative economic systems, and take the side of those who are excluded in society. The second type is what I call charismatic prophetism. And again, it's a term I've chosen because I couldn't get it in a simpler term. And it's today commoner within neo-Pentecostal denominations. So it's characterized by charismatic expressions of spiritual gifts, existential problem-solving spirituality, and a theology framed by addressing material and social needs of people. There are extremes and abuses on both sides, but there is a via media between them which enable us to define what is meant by prophetic voice. After all, in the most positive sense, these two operate under irrefutable conviction about God's will within the concrete existential situation. So whether expressed through the communitarian variety or the charismatic variety, a prophetic African church based on biblical revelation, based on the Spirit's guidance, based on wise theological reflections, based on astute social cultural analysis, is fully convinced of God's will for the concrete realities of the continent and authoritatively expresses this will in word and deed. That is a long definition, but that's what you get when you get Asumang to speak. My colleagues in SATS, in Cherno and Ingala, captured this definition quite well, and I quote them: the African church, to remain credible and impactful, must reclaim its prophetic vocation by advancing a vision of justice, dignity, communal flourishing that resonates with both the biblical concept of shalom and the aspiration of the Africa we want, reimagined, they propose, as the Africa God desires. And I wholly agree with them. But that raises the profound question about our role as theological educators. And here is where I propose that to address these challenges, we must prioritize a type of educational philosophy, which I label, and you may choose a better term, I label as pedagogy of formation of prophets. And we have very solid biblical grounding for fashioning this pedagogy in ressourcement. It is a French word, ressourcement. My brothers from Francophone countries, forgive me. And I like the term ressourcement. But it's going back to the original sources. Whenever there is confusion, you go back to the original primary sources. So ressourcement, I will use ressourcement because it sounds more English, from the Pastoral Epistles. These letters were, after all, written, as the Apostle Paul says in 2 Timothy 3:17, that the man of God may be complete, thoroughly equipped for every good work. It is not a trifle fact that in the whole of the New Testament, these are the only letters where a Christian worker is identified as man of God, and within the context of their formation. For the stock of that term, man of God, is from the Old Testament, where it is almost always synonymous to the prophet or to the prophetic function. These letters were thus precisely designed for the formation of prophetic Christian workers. There are other reasons for turning to the Pastoral Epistles. One is the interesting similarities between the contextual scenarios that these letters address, and I'm very grateful for our dear pastor who preached earlier, between the contextual scenarios that these letters address and the realities of the African context which I have just described. We now know that mid-first century Ephesus experienced rapid socio-theological transformations which generated profound implications for the gospel mission there. I have argued this elsewhere, that Ephesus was in those times demographically complex, commercially rich, socially metropolitan, and politically unpredictable, and religiously a melting pot. The city and its surrounding region, and to some extent also Crete, was a chaotic multi-religious environment, a vibrant regional capital, and a thriving socio-economic center. It is unsurprising, therefore, that rapid expansion of the Christian mission within this context generated severe challenges. Challenges of theological innovations, ecclesiological discipline, and moral relativism. And I contend to you that this contextual background is analogous to our present African realities. We must say accordingly, and here I quote myself again, Paul's strategic construction of a special genre, and the Pastoral Epistles is a special genre, Paul's strategic construction of a special genre for the Pastoral Epistles for the purpose of formation of leaders of some of these churches should be regarded as the biblical template, model, and mandate for efficacious and effective ministerial formation. These letters definitely serve as ressourcement for crafting the pedagogy of formation of prophetic church leaders. How do they specifically do this? Now, on the general level, Paul employs a three-pronged cohesive strategy to address the situation. First was to dismantle heterodoxy and entrench faithful orthodoxy. Almost everything he does is aimed at this: dismantle, throw away the false teaching, and instill a system that entrenches faithful orthodoxy in these churches. That's the first strategy, and we can regard it as immediate. There's urgency about it. I left you there, so you shall do this. So urgent that you've got to do it. But the second was to institute an empirical ecclesiology that would maintain this orthodoxy. In other words, it's a medium-term strategy to make sure that the church that is there will be able to continue this entrenching of faithfulness in the medium term. And then the third one is to nurture a pastoral theology in the recipients, Timothy and Titus, and the other leaders who were the recipients of this, and for us, by the grace of the Holy God, the Holy Spirit, entrench a pastoral theology in these suited for the medium to long-term implementation of their agenda. In other words, he uses the letter medium as an instrument of pedagogy, an instrument of formation of prophetic leaders. The last prong itself, which is my focus, has 4 dimensions to it. Namely, there are those instructions that are aimed at nurturing prophetic identity. Second, there are those that are aimed at nurturing prophetic personal life. Third, there are those that are aimed in defining the prophetic office itself. And fourthly, those that are aimed at clarifying prophetic functions. So this is a very comprehensive. Of these 4 dimensions, the most important to my mind, and yet the least understood, is how Paul uses the letter to intentionally nurture a prophetic identity and habitus in Timothy and Titus. Now, the concept of identity itself is ill-defined, and until recently, most educators fail to register, and by education, I'm not just talking about theological education, education in medicine, education elsewhere, but most educators fail to register that their primary task involves developing and fostering the desired identity in the students. Think of apprenticeship along that line, but that is more than that. It's increasing knowledge, increasing skills, increasing attitudes were only secondary. They were important, but they were only secondary to this imperative to nurture the desired identity in the student. For not only is the fostering of the student's identity and habitus fundamental to their successful functioning after graduation, much more, doing so requires intentionality on the part of the teacher, and the Pastoral Epistles is an exhibit of how it is done. Now, I don't mean to deviate too much into an elaborate lecture, as we warned. This is not an academic one, but I can't fail to emphasize this. Paul's use of the Pastoral Epistles to nurture prophetic identity in Timothy, and by extension, all Christian workers, should teach us a lot of lessons in how we shape our pedagogy. Let me give you an example. When Paul, for example, says to Timothy, 1 Timothy 1:18, "This charge I entrust to you, Timothy, my child, in accordance with the prophecies previously made about you, that by them you may wage the good warfare," Paul was not just defining Timothy's prophetic functions, waging the good warfare. He was doing more than that. He was explicitly and actively nurturing Timothy's self-understanding as a prophet. For he says, by them, by these prophecies, these are the prophecies you use to wage the good warfare. And by the way, you look at that verse, waging the good warfare is creating a prophetic habitus as a warrior who wages the battle against the false religions, the falsehood, the false living in Ephesus. Paul was effectively saying, Timothy, you can only deal with the concrete realities of the mission in Ephesus by taking on a prophetic identity and a warrior habitus. He uses, there are other things that he does. When I've already mentioned the epithets man of God or servant of God in addressing them. It's all the creation of this self-understanding that this is what you are and this is what you ought to inhabit, as a person said. When he uses the adversative "should there," and most English translation use "but as for you," he was creating a specific identity for the prodigy to inhabit, to live by. So based on the Pastoral Epistles, we can define prophetic identity as the composite self-understanding of the Christian worker in relation to their call as the disciple of the Lord Jesus Christ, and with the Spirit's enablement attuned to discerning God's will in the concrete realities of the moment, and so obediently serves God's kingdom in authoritatively expressing his will in word and deed. And the pedagogy of formation of prophetic church workers is an approach to education which is driven by the goal of forming well-rounded believers with prophetic identity and habitus, and thus designed not just to grow them intellectually, but also sharpen their character, deepen their virtues, and clarify the values required for expressing this. I've left myself only a few minutes to reflect on what these ideas practically offer us as we contemplate our response to the concrete realities of the church in Africa. And I believe, based on the insights from the Pastoral Epistles, and there will be many more, that we can identify 5 features of the kind of pedagogy which, when pursued with intentionality and the focused devotion they deserve, with the Spirit's help, will nurture the kind of prophetic men and women fit for the moment. First, we must commit ourselves to intentional formation of prophetic identity and habitus in our students. This, as I have argued, will involve facilitating students' self-understanding of their prophetic calling, nurture the gifts of prophetic insight, prophetic hindsight, and prophetic foresight, and prioritizing practical exemplification as key to training. Second, we must ensure contextualization of the theological curriculum and pedagogy, one that pays attention to the students' lived context, enables them to perform prophetic social analysis of their situations, and firmly understands biblically grounded public theology. Now, contextualization, I know, is a necessary but hazardous skill. And I have chosen the term very well because we can sometimes get ourselves bogged down in thinking that, oh, let's contextualize. It's a hazardous skill. It's a skill that has to be done with discernment. We must not forget that the project that has led to the poverty of Christian expression in the West was a project of contextualization. Contextualization gone wrong. So we shouldn't just talk about contextualization. We should actually think and describe and explain how exactly it should be safely done in the African context. And this involves our students being able to be self-critical in how the interaction between theological knowledge and real-life scenarios are assessed, how the necessary analogization of ancient texts with contemporary society are critically performed, and how disciplined reflections to curate the contextualized truths are achieved. I'm sure we can have more conversations about it later. Let me go to the third. Integration of theory with reflection and practice. Now, this demands interdisciplinary coherence between theory in biblical studies and systematic theology on the one hand, and immersive practice in the community on the other hand. I know by experience that this integrative approach to theology is very hard work, because we have to cross certain boundaries between the disciplines that are very difficult to cross. Even so, if we are to produce prophetic leaders, then we have little choice but to overcome the obstacles. And fourth is the character transformation in virtue as a central plank of our theological education. The somewhat popular pedagogy of Christian ethics, which focuses on ethical debates, has its place. But if we are to form prophets, we must pivot towards the more transformative pedagogy, which analyzes, prescribes, and exemplifies Christian virtues. Our future leaders must know how to be wise, how to be courageous, how to be self-sacrificing, and faithful prophets, not just how to be critically minded debaters. And finally, it's the issue of the church and seminary relationship. I know in Africa the relationship is better, but we cannot be complacent about this, especially as the politics of governmental accreditation are gradually insinuating themselves between the seminary and church in some of our countries. Ultimately, we theological educators must resist the temptation to turn our institutions into ivory towers that are divorced from the realities of our churches, regardless of what our governments say. Now, I know that each one of these will need to be fleshed on, and as you can see, my time is far gone. But these are summed up by a paper which was released by our own executive director in a chapter of a book which was published last year. And it is presciently, the chapter is titled Theological Education as Formation of Prophets for the Church and Society. I should have actually printed that out and read it here. That would have kept you more awake. Let me conclude. The church in Africa is today presented with enormous opportunities of not only entrenching faithful orthodoxy in our continent, but also embracing leadership to safeguard this faithful orthodoxy around the world. It is God who is putting it on us. We didn't seek for it. For 50 years, we fought. We didn't seek for it, but it's God. And I think we need to realize this. That's God asking us. It is our time to do what His will and obey His call. Now, these come with tremendous challenges, which I hope my talk hasn't overlooked. We need a theological education system which is contextual, transformative, and engage with these opportunities. And I've argued that the Pastoral Epistles ressourcement to the Bible and Pastoral Epistles will provide us with the language, the ideas, and the guidance for prioritizing this type of education. May the Lord help us, each one of us, to reflect the work that He has given us and serve the purposes of His kingdom. Amen.